That's why healthy populations are important if you want to maximize the diversity. It starts with a healthy population, and then when you're doing, so what we're all doing, no matter how well we sample from that population, we are selecting just by the fact that we're not, we're taking a subset of the population. So the next thing is it's really important that when you're doing production, that when you're making the collections, that you're randomizing your collection so that you're getting as much of the variation that exists in the population as is reasonable in an effort. You're not going to get it all, but that the variation exists in the population as a whole. It's not what exists in any one individual. It's subtle, but it's. I mean, if you read what Darwin said, I mean and that's why managing populations are really important, is because it's often very hard, if not impossible, to in any exacting way define what the population is. But he recognized that variation occurs over distance and time. It's a whole different set of problems, and for conservation. So, I often use the example of animal conservation because it's more accessible to people. But if you think about, issues with like saving tigers, the populations are getting smaller and smaller. And so, zoos have to deal with things like inbreeding, depression. And, when you're doing restoration ecology, that's what you want to plant and establish. And so you're not, generally speaking, you're not, too worried when you're establishing a new population or a new planting. You're not overly concerned with a huge amount of biodiversity. So you're not, maybe there's hundreds of species that constitute this particular ecosystem in a mature, undisturbed state. You're not instantly going to put all those back in a planting. Many of them wouldn't even survive. So you start with the keystone species that really critical. I mean, in an urban setting, so many, just dealing with invasives is such a huge problem. And to think you're going to go from a hugely invaded field, to some successful outcome, in 2 years is just crazy in my view. I mean, you need 2 to 5 years. I mean, that's what got this place started. Is we needed plants, and where were we going to get them from? And the only group that was around doing it were 2 people, who were in a facility a couple miles from here doing it on a very small scale. But they were learning how to propagate natives, and and this place was available from the family, and that facility where they were working was too small for the scale of production we needed, and this place was the right scale. So, to really get out there and not only learn the species, but learn to recognize when you're in a given habitat and see in a heightened way what plants are there and how they're associated, which ones are associated with each other, and what are the conditions that are prevailing where you're seeing this species, so that, you bring that sensitivity to your design. Knowing the species and a little bit about its more horticultural properties is only, in my view, the beginning of the knowledge that you need to bring to ecological design anyway. But climate change is happening and it's real, and models are models, and they're predictions of how things are going to go. Both, and again, the two big. Well, 3 big variables is how fast the climate is going to change, but also, so that's the temporal aspect of it, but also the direction in which, so species are going to do one of 3 things. They're either have enough plasticity in their genotype to adapt where they are, and that, again, that's why we need healthy populations. So, there's a bunch of all kinds of species here and habitats here in New York City that are very marginal already because they're just tiny little remnants, and there aren't a lot of individuals, and and many of those are probably extinct already. The reality is, my botanists that go out and collect seed and understand, spend all their time out in these environments. We sat down and a few years ago, and they were able to recognize over 25 distinct habitat types just in New York City. Again, many of these are remnant. Many of them are probably functionally extinct. Some of them may not be any bigger than this property or smaller. But that amount of diversity is out there, and so there's that. So first of all, when we're looking to increase diversity, we should, within existing ecosystems, we should look to those species that, first of all, are most common but are lacking from that site, and think about reintroducing them. Mm-hmm. The other thing we should be thinking about, which in and of itself doesn't add to biodiversity, but again strengthens the resiliency of populations, is to think about supplementing populations that are in small numbers because of isolation and fragmentation. And that's a process that's called augmentation. And that's the careful reintroduction of additional individuals to increase population size. But that has to be done very carefully. The discussion that's going on right now with my staff is what are the appropriate species to be putting back into those more intact ecosystems. And so those are the two things I want to consider very strongly is what are the candidates that are ripe for reintroduction? What are things that were lost there that were quite possibly lost, just wholesale loss because of development or whatever, that should function well in there, and what species are left in there that are that would benefit from augmentation. And that's where I think we have a unique laboratory here that no other city has, in the fact that we have the Native Plant Center, and we bank seed, we bank individual populations in such a way that every one of those collections has a unique number, and so we can handpick populations to reintroduce or to use for augmentation. Mm-hmm. And that's a huge asset that most cities wouldn't have at their disposal. So we can boutique design these reintroductions, if you will, but pick particular populations to use.